All right, welcome to week 4. Last week we talked a bit about narrative analysis and the parts that make up a narrative, particularly when we are looking at TV. Today we are going to talk a bit more about how this idea of narrative analysis applies when we are looking at culture and stories more broadly. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about narrative, genre, and this idea of cultural narratives, dominant narratives and counter narratives, to talk a little bit about what some of those terms mean. When I say narrative, basically what I'm talking about is an account of related events, experiences, and information told or written in the form of a story. It is one of the ways that we organize information and kind of make sense of it and order it. Genre, typically when we are using that term, it's in the context of fictional stories, but it can apply to in non-fictional context as well. Basically what genre is, it's defining the type of narrative that is being told by its structural and topical characteristics. So really looking at the pieces of it and the approach that the storyteller is taking to it. So when we're thinking about genre, we're thinking about types of stories and categories of stories, like horror, detective stories, fairy tales. Those are in kind of the fictional realm, which is what we are talking about most of the time when we use that term, but genre also applies in informational context. So a news report would be a narrative genre. That would be an example of a nonfiction genre, the mode of storytelling. A cultural narrative is essentially a story that helps a community or members of a shared culture assign meaning to its shared history, its identity, and its current existence. So if you think back to week 2, when we were talking about Stuart Hall and the idea of conceptual maps and having this sort of shared idea among a culture of what a specific concept is, a cultural narrative is basically a conceptual map in the form of a story. So cultural narratives might look like myths, legends, accounts of history that are intended to communicate shared values, ideals, and shared identity. So to give an example, cultural narratives are usually, when we're talking about those are like very widely circulated, shared stories among members of the same culture. In order to be that widely circulated, those are usually very short, simple stories that get right to the heart of that idea of values, shared identity, history. The example that I like to use of what a cultural narrative looks like is kind of the classic American immigration story. Again, very short, very simple. It's one that we teach to the school children in like 2nd or 3rd grade. And as this cultural narrative goes, it is as the great melting pot, America has always been a country of immigrants, and immigrants are drawn to the land of opportunity, where with enough hard work, anyone can achieve the American dream. And as you can see, this narrative really gets right to the core of A lot of different values that we are trying to signal when we tell and circulate that story. We've got this idea of the great melting pot, which is a lot of different parts coming together in this sense of unity. A country of immigrants kind of plays on that idea of coming from far away and making a new life. We've got land of opportunity, this idea of freedom and possibility. And then also balanced with this idea of hard work being the key to achieving the American dream, making that better life for yourself. So, cultural narratives, when we are thinking about these, we can't necessarily stop just at the narrative itself, particularly in the context of this class, when we are thinking really deeply about diversity, thinking about identity, we also need to be thinking about power when we are thinking about cultural narratives. So a couple of different terms that I want us to be able to apply here are dominant narratives and counter narratives. So when I say the dominant narrative, that is usually one that is most aligned with the most widely circulated cultural narratives. Those are typically coming from the perspective of groups that have historically held the majority of social and political power. Dominant narratives align with the current status quo, so keeping things as they are. Dominant narratives support or justify current systems and ways of things working or current power structures. And another thing the dominant narratives tend to do in the world is that they frame the existing social systems and power dynamics as natural or correct or the only way that things can be. Counter narratives, on the other hand, offer a different perspective from what is that very widely circulated narrative. This is typically coming from a perspective of groups who have historically been marginalized or excluded from social and political power. And there's a few different things that a counter narrative might do. It might offer an alternative perspective that is just outside of that dominant narrative. It might directly contradict or challenge that dominant narrative. It might challenge the status quo, question things as they are, or it might complicate existing cultural narratives. So to give a couple of examples of what each of those look like, so to return back to our example of the classic American immigration story, we've got the great American melting pot. America has always been a country of immigrants, and immigrants are drawn to the land of opportunity where anyone, through enough hard work, can achieve the American dream. So the dominant narrative in that example would be the United States of America has always been a country of immigrants. One counter narrative to that might challenge that dominant narrative might come from an indigenous perspective, which might say the land that we now call America was historically made up of hundreds of different indigenous tribes and nations. The country as it exists today was founded by colonizers rather than immigrants. Another example of the dominant narrative coming through that earlier example is America is this great melting pot of many cultures. This message of through our differences, there is a sense of national unity. And there are a couple of counter narratives coming in this week's episodes, or first last week's. So these two examples offer a sort of complication to that initial dominant narrative of the melting pot, where it says this might be partially true, but also there are these added elements to this. It's not so simple. So my first example is we have in Hollywood by Ryan Murphy, we've got the character of Raymond, played by Darren Criss, and we see him able to get work directing movies, but only movies about white people. And he is explicitly told that stories reflecting his Asian American identity won't play to American audiences. So he is able to assimilate and work in Hollywood as a director, but he's not able to bring his entire identity to that or tell the kinds of stories he's most interested in telling that are most reflective of his own experience and that of his family. A different example, again, complicating this dominant narrative of the melting pot, which is essentially a story of assimilation into American culture. We've got the example of Kim from Special, and we see Kim as an Indian American woman in her 30s. We see how her attempts at assimilation and fitting in have posed major financial and social challenges. And she confronts her father about this as he is admonishing her for having credit card debt and not taking pride in her Indian heritage. And her sorts of attempts at assimilation end up leaving her at odds with her parents, who she accuses of only hanging out with other Indians and not attempting to be a part of this sort of melting pot. So while we have this idea of assimilation being an option, we see multiple perspectives here. We've got Kim, who has attempted this, but at a major cost, both financially, socially, and psychologically for her. And we've also got her parents, on the other hand, who seem a bit more kind of comfortable with who they are, but largely excluded from mainstream social life. So what I want to emphasize with cultural narratives, dominant narratives, and counter narratives is that many of these stories can be true. At the same time, all of these stories are incomplete. So as we are thinking about and looking at cultural narratives, trying to figure out, is this a counter narrative? Is this a dominant narrative? What is this doing in the world? Some initial questions we might want to think through are, whose perspective is being reflected? Who is telling this story? And thinking a bit more broadly about whose stories get repeated, elevated, amplified, whose stories never get heard, whose stories are told once and never again, whose stories end up silenced. And then finally, who shapes that story? Who is in control of how that story gets told and how the people in it are painted?